History of John Oldham and his wife Sarah Hodgkinson, written by Fern Oldham Coates. John Oldham was born July 23, 1823, in Norman Town, Shirebrook Parish, England. He married Sarah Hodgkinson of Mickleaver, England, September 13, 1848, in Derby, England, at the parish of St. Werburgh. Sarah was born May 4, 1832, to Thomas Hodgkinson and Jane Gaskin. They both heard the LDS missionaries and were baptized in 1855. Deseret News Obituary, December 10, 1915. John and Sarah had a son John, a son James, and another son John, who all died in England nearly at the same time. So when they decided to come to Utah, they had just 2 children left. John Oldham, 33 years old, his wife Sarah, 23, their daughter, Jane Eliza, age 4, and their baby son, Louis William, 6 months, left Liverpool, England, May 22, 1856, on the ship Horizon along with 852 saints under the direction of Edward Martin to come to Zion. They arrived safely in Boston, June 30, 1856. They traveled to New York, then to Philadelphia, and from there by baggage train to Iowa City, Iowa, the most westerly railway terminus, arriving July 8, 1856. The Handcart movement in Europe was launched in January 1856 by the President of the European Mission, as suggested by President Brigham Young. They expected to find handcarts and provisions ready for them but were met with great disappointments. Mormon artisans were making the carts at Iowa City for them, but they were not ready. They camped along the Cedar River in Iowa City while they were waiting. The summer rains were on, and they were very uncomfortably situated. As time dragged on, they became disheartened, but were cheered by hope and faith that God would care for them. It was July 28, 1856, when they were ready to leave, but it was much too late in the season when these immigrants started on their long journey to Zion. They were already weary from the long ocean voyage and the rough and crowded trip on the baggage train. Many felt it unwise to start on the handcart journey this season. Others did not realize the unpredictable things that could happen and could only see suffering if they remained camped along the river. Many had parts of families already in Salt Lake and were anxious to reach them at all costs. President Brigham didn't know of their late start until they were well on their way, or he would have insisted they remain there until spring. Their handcarts weighed about 60 pounds and carried 100 pounds of baggage. The weight dwindled as supplies were consumed or weight added as sick and tired men, women, or children rode. 5 persons were assigned to each cart, and to each train of carts was one covered wagon drawn by 3 yoke of oxen, carrying tents and luggage limited to 17 pounds per person. Some head of cows completed the organization. The handcarts cost from $10 to $20. These carts varied in pattern but were fitted with twin shafts 5 feet long with crossbars at the end of the shafts so that they might be pulled horse fashion or pushed. The carts were hurriedly constructed and some made from unseasoned lumber. Some of the axles broke in a few days and many mechanics were busy at night repairing the accidents of the day. As the axles finally wore out, wheels fell apart and many broke down beyond repair. Most had to be patched constantly along the trail using buffalo hide and metal from the cooking utensils. The Edward Martin Handcart Company consisted of 575 souls, 146 carts, 7 wagons, 6 mules and horses, and 50 beef and cows. It was the duty of the wagons to see that no one was left behind to suffer and to pick up and care for any who were unable to travel by foot. They were accompanied by 2 wagon trains, one under the direction of William Hodgett and one under the direction of John A. Hunt. The William Handcart Company left on July 15, and Martin's Handcart Company left on July 28, with the wagon trains following in early August. A Levi Savage, who had just returned from a mission, advised them not to go. You are a company of aged people, women, and children. Even if you do have strong men among you, you cannot cross the mountains so late in the season without much suffering, sickness, and death. He advised them to go to winter quarters but was overruled, so decided to endure the hardships with them. So they plodded along, day after day, until they reached the Wyoming line. Provisions were cut to 3/4 of a pound of flour a day. The Indians were bad and men had to stand guard every night. The weather was cold and the suffering increased. The flour was cut to 1/2 pound per day. Many of the older people died and many young people could not stand the hardships. E. McBride, a member of this ill-fated Handcart Company, tells the following: "It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when we started. Many grumbled at the late start, but Captain Martin told them to be patient and they would see the wisdom of it. We crossed the Iowa River and traveled about 5 miles when we camped for the night. After camping, there was singing, etc. until 9 o'clock when the sound of the bugle called everyone to prayers. So we crossed the Iowa prairies, over rivers and small streams until we reached the Missouri River at Council Bluffs. We traveled up the river about 3 miles to Florence. There we took 2 to 3 days to ferry across the river. There we waited several days for Daniel Tyler's company to arrive. The company being large, we traveled very slowly across the Nebraska plains. Several aged persons died and were buried by the roadside. After the sad rites were over, we went on our way, burning buffalo chips for fuel and to cook our frugal meals. The children and old folks would start early in the morning to get as far as we could until the others with the handcarts would overtake us. The ox teams that hauled the tents and provisions usually traveled behind the handcarts. Many of the carts broke down or we would lose some of the cattle, and thus we were detained. It was quite an undertaking to transport 1,500 people who had never been away from home and had never seen a campfire before in their lives. I will never forget one day when we saw 3,000 Sioux Indian warriors dressed in their war paint, going east to fight the Pawnees. I remember how they jabbered and laughed at each other and how frightened we were. But they gave us the road and made signs to us that they were our friends, that they would not hurt us as we were mostly squaws and papooses and it would not be a brave act to try to kill us. We were forbidden by our leaders to kill buffalo because it made the Indians angry, so we used to hire the Indians to kill for us. I remember the first one I saw killed. An Indian was after a young buffalo cow. When she would try to turn, he would shoot an arrow into the side of her head to keep her headed straight for our camp. When he got her to the road, he shot an arrow into the side of her just back of her shoulders, and it was buried to the feathers of the arrow. She rolled over dead. The Indians were given about 5 cents worth of tobacco for the job. At the old site of winter quarters, then known as Florence, Nebraska, they were still suffering alternately rain and mud. Each day shortened their food supplies for the long journey ahead. At this time Captain Edward Martin was given Captain Tyler as an assistant. Both had served in the Mormon Battalion from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. E. McBride also tells this story. At about 10:30 this morning we passed Fort Kearney, and as one of the most singular deaths occurred on our journey at this time, I will give a brief and truthful narration of the incident. 2 bachelors named Luke Carter and Edwards from Manchester, England, each about 50 to 55 years of age, had pulled a covered cart together from Iowa City, Iowa, to this point. They slept in the same tent, cooked and bunked together, but for several days previous, unpleasant and cross words had passed between them. Edwards was a tall, loosely built and slender man physically, and Carter more stocky and sturdy. He had favored Edwards by letting the latter pull only what he could in the shafts for some time. This morning he grumbled and complained, still talking about being tired and that he couldn't go any farther. Carter retorted, come on, you'll be all right again when you get a bit of dinner at noon." But Edwards kept on begging for him to stop the cart and let him lie down and die. Carter replied, "Well, get out and die then." The cart was instantly stopped. Carter raised the shafts of the cart. Edwards walked from under the shafts and to the south of the road a couple of rods, laid his body down on the level prairie, and in 10 minutes was a corpse. We waited, a few carts of us, a few minutes longer till the captain came up and closed Edwards' eyes. A light-loaded cart was unloaded. The body was put thereon, covered with a quilt, and Carter pulled him to Noon Camp some 5 or 6 miles where we dug his grave and buried him a short distance west of Fort Kearney, Nebraska. August 25th, the company moved from Florence to Dulter's Park, 2½ miles, camped, stayed there the next day and night, then moved on. A number of missionaries left Florence, Nebraska, September 3rd, and arrived in Salt Lake, October 4th, 1856, and informed President Young of the conditions and sufferings of Captain Willie's and Martin's Handcart people. A conference was stopped, and the people were sent home to get materials and supplies to send to these suffering saints, and by October 7th, a relief train had left Salt Lake to greet them. The company arrived at Fort Laramie, October 8, and camped east of Laramie Fork. In the Black Hills the roads were harder, more rocky, and more hilly, and this told upon the handcarts, causing them to fail more rapidly, become rickety, and need more frequent repairing. One man's handcart broke down one afternoon in the hills, and by some mischance the company all went on, leaving him behind alone with his broken cart and his family's little stock of worldly goods thereon. He anxiously waited for someone to turn back and help him, but no one came. Night drew on, and still he was all alone, except for the presence of a prowling wolf, which could be seen in the streak of light on the western horizon. Happily, just as darkness was settling down, Captain Hodgett's wagon company was seen coming down the opposite hill from the east. He eagerly went to them and told his tale of misfortune, and they took him in for the night. The Martin Company had just crossed the Sweetwater when a terrible storm came upon them, and the suffering of the group was intense. Bedding had been discarded along the way that the load might become lighter and was very much needed at this time. Deaths from extreme cold, exhaustion, and lack of food were frequent. Then, to add to this, the people had eaten fresh meat from a few oxen that could go no farther, and dysentery came into the camp to take its toll. October 19, they crossed the Platte River for the last time at Red Butte. Margaret Ann Griffith, also a member of the Martin Handcart Company, tells of her experiences. Margaret's father was taken ill and had to ride in the provision wagon. One day, feeling better, he tried to walk, but he was not able to keep up, so he took hold of the rod at the end gate of the last wagon. When the teamster saw him, he slashed Mr. Griffiths with the whip and the sick man fell to the ground and could not get up. The handcarts were ahead, and Margaret did not know what had happened to her father until they reached camp that night. Although her poor feet were aching, she went back 3 miles but could not find him. There had been another camp in another direction, and her father had seen their tracks and crawled on his hands and knees in the deep snow to their camp. That night, at 11 o'clock, 2 men took him to his own division. When they were 50 miles on the other side of Devil's Gate, deep snow and cold weather forced them to camp. Because the only food in the camp was 4 ounces of flour a day per person, many of the courageous pioneers died at this camp. One of these was Margaret's 12-year-old brother. When they reached Independence Rock, they were forced to remain a week. At this place, another member of her family passed away. This was her 6-year-old brother, Herbert, who was frozen to death. Mrs. Patience Loder Rosa Archer, in telling her story, reminds us of our dear Sarah Hodgkinson. She also left luxury, comforts, and a family who disowned her to come to Zion. When Mrs. Archer's family emigrated to New York, they expected to work there until they had earned enough money to equip them for the journey across the plains. They were soon told to join the Saints in Iowa City, Iowa, where they would leave with the Martin Handcart Company, which consisted of many nationalities, many from Scandinavia. They left Florence, Nebraska, August 25, 1856, but were soon delayed by the birth of a baby to Mrs. Archer's sister, Zilpah Williams. They loaded the sick woman, her baby, and another small child on the handcart and from then on made very slow progress. William Clough came to their rescue by roping the cart to his saddle and pulling them many miles. After he left us, said Mrs. Archer, 5 Indians came upon us, demanding our food. We showed them the sick woman, and they hurried away, fearing some dread disease. At another place, a Mr. Gabbett rode up to them and offered them a ride on his horse. Mrs. Williams, worn out with carrying her baby, accepted his offer. A few days later, the company stopped where a campfire still burned. Here, beside some newly made graves, was Mrs. Williams' green sunbonnet. Part of the party had been killed. A teamster who escaped told their sad story. After that, they did not dare to build a fire to prepare food for the sick ones. At one time, when asked to sing at a campfire program, her mother explained, "We have to save our strength for gathering wood." She also tells that when they faced starvation, they prayed for help, and the next morning they found a discarded beef head, which the mother gratefully made into life-saving soup. John Watkins tells the following experiences of their trials. John was the one who signaled for them to march, to pitch their tents, and to go to bed. He was called the bugler, and it was also his job to call the people to their prayers. While traveling through the state of Iowa with nearly 600 immigrants and with the dust of harvest weather upon us and the sun's rays pouring down on our heads, we were tantalized by the people who came out of their homes saying, "That is a hard way to serve the Lord." Young hoodlums would go ahead of the company to the next river or creek to ridicule our wives and daughters who had to raise their dresses out of the water to wade the streams, as there were few bridges in those days. The roads were very heavy, sometimes with sand, mud, or dust. Progress was much slower than had been calculated, and consequently, when we got out on the prairies our food ran short, and our rations were cut down one half. Rations continued to be cut, and the people grew very weak with starvation as the cold weather of winter approached. We were all frightened and council was called, at which it was decided to lighten the loads to a few pounds each. This was weighed out to us on a pair of scales. By the side of the trail we left our quilts, blankets, overcoats, cooking utensils, and everything that later we needed so badly. The night after we crossed the last crossing of the Platte River, the snow started to fall and winter set in. The cold and hunger were so intense that we stayed a day or two in camp. Before we moved camp, we buried 14 people in one grave who had died from cold and hunger. Up to this time a great number had been buried along the way. When at last the company of rescuers arrived from Salt Lake with supplies, it did not increase our rations any. The only difference it made was that our rations continued as they had been instead of giving out entirely. The company, when they started to our relief, had plenty of provisions, but had met 2 or 3 other companies on the road who were out of food. These starving immigrants had been given some of the supplies, and when the wagons reached us, there was little left. We had been traveling many days in the snow and the cattle had nothing to eat. They became so poor and weak that they would lie down and no persuasion or beating would induce them to go on. On one occasion I noticed an ox that was left to perish, and I conceived the idea that if I went back in the night I might kill it and thus get something that would help to sustain life. I told my plan to William L. Binder, who occupied the same tent with me, and I invited him to help me kill the ox and bring in some of the meat. But Binder's feet were so badly frozen that he could not go, so his wife offered to go in his place. I did not like the idea of going alone, miles out on the plains, with another man's wife, so I invited a man by the name of James Hunter to help us share the beef. We waited until after nightfall when all the camp had retired to their beds, then we 3, with a handcart, crept quietly and secretly from the camp. If we had been discovered, we would not have been allowed to go out to risk our lives on such an expedition. We were all highly elated to get from camp without being discovered and began our tramp back across the prairie in the direction we had come during the day. It was a bright moonlit night. The frost and snow sparkled, throwing back reflections like diamonds. The wind was blowing and it was bitter cold, freezing the snow which was about 18 inches deep. No one can realize the intense cold of a night like this unless he has spent one in a similar place in midwinter. We were all thinly clad and armed with all the implements of destruction we could get, a small rifle of about .22 caliber with one load, an old case knife with both sides of the handle broken off, and a small shingling hatchet with a handle 7 inches long and one corner broken off. We traveled back hunting for the ox and came upon it about 5 miles from camp. It was standing, chilled and freezing. We stopped a few minutes to counsel, knowing it was impossible to kill it where it stood, the distance too great to haul the meat. In coming out I had noticed a deep ravine, 1.5 miles from camp. I thought if we could get the ox there, we would be a little sheltered from the wind and that much nearer to camp to haul the meat. We decided to drive the ox there. By this time the woman was so cold that suddenly she gave up and was determined to go no farther. She began pleading and begging to lie down. I told Mr. Hunter that she was dying and that if she did die, we would be hung for murder, for it was really no more or less than murder to bring a woman so thinly clad out on such a night. If we let her have her own way she would certainly die, for the death sleep that precedes freezing was upon her. We didn't like to leave the ox, so we decided to place the woman in the shafts of the handcart and let her lean against the brace that was built there for placing the breast against when pulling the cart. Then I got in the shafts with the woman, placed an arm on the cart and supported her with the other arm, making her walk in spite of her cries and entreaties. Mr. Hunter took the hatchet and drove the ox, for the only way to make him move was by striking his backbone with the hatchet, and that sounded like striking a board. When I became tired in the shafts, Mr. Hunter would take my place and I would take his. Thus we changed places at short intervals until at last we managed to reach the ravine. It was as we expected, a little sheltered from the wind. The woman by this time was a little revived from her walk. We set the handcart up on end and placed her in it to protect her from the cold. Then we made ready for the ox. I was not a very good marksman, so I knew that I must take good aim. I pointed my gun straight at the forehead of the animal and fired, but just as I fired, the ox moved its head and the last load I had in the world had missed its mark. We were then in a dilemma, for we did not like to leave our ox after all our trouble, so we tried to cut his throat. The snow was too deep, so we could not find a rock with which to sharpen our case knife. I held the ox by the horns while Mr. Hunter took hold of the loose skin of the throat with one hand and with the other he held the knife and began sawing. When Mr. Hunter got tired of sawing, I sawed a while. The ox would stand still until his throat began to hurt, then he would run off and we'd have to catch him again and bring him back to repeat the operation. The knife was so dull that we could never tell where we sawed last. We continued this mock butchery for nearly an hour without making any impression, so we gave up the scheme in despair. We then decided to try the hatchet, but it had one corner broken off so we could not hurt the ox much with that. Hunter would hold him by the horns while I hit him on the head with the hatchet, but after each blow he would break away and would have to catch him again. Then Hunter would think he could strike harder than I and he would try. Then I would get out of patience with Hunter, and I told him that he did not half hit the ox, and he told me to try myself if I thought I could do better. We kept changing places until we had a place in the ox's head nearly the size of a hand where the hide was hacked up like mincemeat. Hunter at last gave the final blow and the ox staggered and fell to the ground, taking me with him. I fell underneath his head and shoulders, hurting me terribly and pinning me to the ground so that I could not move. I told Hunter to blaze away at him while I was down, for I was afraid that he would get up and run off again. We remembered that we could get only one lick at him when he was on his feet. He did not get up again, for Hunter had killed him. When we were sure that he was dead and I was liberated from beneath him, we made ready to skin him. We tried to saw through the hide, but not being experienced butchers we could not get through the thick hair and hide. We tried to get a start at the eyes and then at the mouth, thinking the skin would be thinner in these places. Finally, we got the ox on his back and got through the skin. We then found that it was much easier to saw on the edge of the hide after it was once started. At last we got him cut open and brought the woman to the side of it. She was glad to put her hands in the warm blood to keep them from freezing. By this little warmth she seemed to get so much better that we all felt happy. The knife and the hatchet would freeze to our hands and we had to thaw them in the warm blood and entrails, but we thought we were doing a good job and would get something to eat, so we worked away until the ox was cut up and loaded on the handcart. Mr. Hunter did not like to leave the head, he thought it would make good soup. Then he wanted the feet, so we loaded them on, but they proved too heavy and we were all too weak to pull the load, so we threw the head away. We then started on our way back to camp. All at once Mr. Hunter gave out, as the woman had previously done. He begged piteously for us to let him lie down and sleep, but I knew that he was freezing to death and that the only hope of saving him was to make him walk. We put him between us and pulled the handcart, as well as Mr. Hunter, for he just let his legs drag. It was very hard work, but we managed to get him and the beef to camp. Mr. Binder was waiting up for us. He was sitting by a few sagebrush coals with a tin cup and a bone stewing in it. When we reached the few smouldering coals, we let go of Hunter and he fell prostrate across the fire. Freezing and starving, he seized the tin cup and immediately swallowed its contents. We managed to get him and his share of beef to his tent just as day was breaking. We had been out the whole night. Drinking that boiling soup made Mr. Hunter so sick that he was not able to help himself nor hide his meat. Consequently, when people began moving around, they discovered his meat and notified Captain Edward Martin. As I was the bugler, Captain Martin sent for me and told me to call the people together. The captain told them he understood there was meat in the camp, and that poor meat was better than none, and that it must be divided. I slipped away from the crowd and hid my meat and that belonging to Mrs. Binder. I wrapped it in our clothing and hid it in every available place. When they questioned Mr. Hunter, he was too sick to give information as to where he had obtained the meat. From that time on, He had to be hauled to Salt Lake, and after that it took him 3 months with the best nursing to recover from that night's adventure. One of their greatest trials was that of burying their dead. The ground was frozen hard and the only implements they had to dig the graves with were a short-handled shovel, an axe that had become so dull from cutting the frozen ground that the edge was nearly as dull as the back, and a short-handled hatchet. The men were so weak that they could only dig a short time, and then let someone else take a turn. The graves were so shallow that scarcely enough dirt was obtainable to cover the bodies. The men realized that the wolves, howling nearby, would soon dig them up. The people were so weak that only courage kept them alive. Elizabeth Bradshaw proved her great faith. Although she was a very small dainty little woman, she took her youngest son, Richard, a lad of 6, and seated him upon her shoulders. With his legs around her neck, he held on to her head and they started to go across a stream. Unfortunately, they were caught by a ripple in the water and were carried some distance down the stream below the fort. It looked as if it were inevitable for both mother and son. Some called to her, "Let the boy go from your shoulders or you will both be drowned. Save yourself and let him go into the water." She refused and struggled on until she finally reached the opposite side at a place where the bank was very high and steep. She could not possibly climb out. Men came to her assistance. Someone reached down, took Richard from her shoulders, and pulled him up the steep bank to safety. Others helped her out of the water. In her exhausted condition, she raised her right arm to the square as a witness of the testimony she then bore to the waiting crowd, that God had protected and saved them both. Before she left England, she told her relatives that a servant of the Lord had pronounced a blessing upon her head and promised that she would take all her children to Zion. At another time her 17-year-old son, Samuel, was brought into camp and pronounced dead. To all appearance it was true, but her faith remained unchanged. She still believed she would take all of her children to Zion, so she asked the elders to anoint him with oil and administer to him. They did, and he recovered through this blessing and the tender care of his mother. October 28th was a memorable day. Joseph A. Young, Daniel Jones, and Abel Gar galloped unexpectedly into camp from Salt Lake. These men were an advance from the lead relief company. They said help was waiting the sufferers at Devil's Gate. One of the men described the meeting of the Martin Handcart people as follows: "A condition of distress here met my eyes that I never saw before or since. The train was strung out for 3 or 4 miles. There were old men pulling and tugging their carts, sometimes loaded with a sick wife and children. Women were pulling their sick husbands, and little children 6 to 8 years old were struggling through the mud and snow. As night came on, the mud would freeze on their clothes and feet. We gathered up some of the most helpless and with our lariats tied to their carts we helped as many as we could into camp. This was a bitter Wednesday night, and we had no fuel except very small brush. Several died that night. They had lost 56 of their number since crossing the North Platte 9 days before. 4 days later, the Handcart Company arrived at Devil's Gate, with the snow frozen so hard it was impossible to drive the tent pegs into it. This was about the 1st of November. The company was moved 2 to 3 miles from the fort to Martin's Cove in the mountains for fuel and shelter. Because they were over in the cove, they were nearly missed by the relief wagons. It became impossible to travel farther without reconstitution or help. When the relief party came, many handcarts were discarded and all surplus baggage was left in charge of Captain Dan Jones, Thomas Alexander, and Ben Hampton, and 23 immigrants at the fort. They stayed to guard the things against the Indians during the winter. The immigrants had 1 day's quarter ration of food left when the relief train arrived. 2 prophecies had been made in the company that were fulfilled at this time. The day before, fresh meat had been promised the famished saints before another day. They were also promised that they would ride into the valley. When the relief wagons came, the carts were thrown to one side and they rode into the valley on November 30th, 1856. The snow was up to the bellies of the horses. Most of the saints rode into the valley that day, but a few kept coming through the first 2 weeks of December. John Oldham and his family arrived December 5, 1856. These stories do not tell specifically of John and Sarah Hodgkinson Oldham and their 2 small children. However, as members of the Martin Handcart Company, they certainly experienced similar hardships and trials. The John Oldham family lived in Salt Lake for 2 years, then moved to Spanish Fork, Utah. Here they lived in a root cellar. They were very poor. They had a very small ration of flour, dug roots, peeled their skins off and ate them, and then caught fish from Utah Lake. While living here, Emmeline was born April 25, 1858, Thomas, January 15, 1860, Joseph Heber, November 21, 1861, and Charles Henry, December 2, 1863. From here, they were sent to Richfield, Utah to settle. They were original pioneers in Richfield, but the Indians were so bad that they had to scatter to different communities, so the Oldhams went to Mount Pleasant, Utah. It was in 1866 that they moved to Mount Pleasant, and on October 30, 1867, Sarah was born. Then in 1872, their last child, Ernest Albert, was born and died in 1873. On September 21, 1870, John Oldham became a citizen of the United States. The following are incidents in the life of Sarah Hodgkinson Oldham as remembered and told by Belle Oldham Reynolds, a granddaughter, to Fern Oldham Coates, a great-granddaughter. Grandma, Sarah, was lying in bed in the southwest bedroom in her home east of the now Mount Pleasant city limits where her husband had homesteaded 4 40-acre parcels, when a white figure came through the window saying, "Whosoever I put my hand upon, it means death." Then she felt a slap upon her cheek. All the time she felt it would be Grandpa, John. The next day, Grandpa was in the field east of their house using a big heavy roller on the land. 2 children were with him, Johnny Olson and Josie, his grandchildren. Their son Thomas had come into the house to get a button sewed on his pants and his mother had told him to keep eyes on his pa because he had the 2 children with him. Before she had even finished sewing on the button, the oxen came rushing past the window with the roller. Grandma and Tom ran out and found Grandpa by a willow bush, and when they got to him, he was dead. The roller had gone over his head on the same cheek and the same place where she had been slapped by the figure the night before. The children had become frightened and had run away and hid. It took a long time to find them. She had brought pretty silver napkin rings with her from England. She always had linen napkins in the rings at every meal. Always, she had a tablecloth on the table. She always drank tea. In the window by her breakfast table, her Bible was kept and she always read 2 chapters from it every morning after breakfast before getting up to do the dishes. Stake President Adolph Mers often came to see her on Sundays. He loved to converse with her as she was so well read on the Bible. She read a lot, but never fiction. She was an excellent housekeeper, scrubbed her floors on her hands and knees, and even the outside porches were as white as clean snow. She used blankets on her beds and had a beautiful sham on her bed, embroidery effects over the pillows. They read Father and Mother in white with red braid. She became very bitter toward the church. All of her children attended the Presbyterian church school located in the city. She took off her garments and attended their church. The Presbyterians were very good to her, but Mormon elders came and blessed her the night she died. She left off her HS when she talked, and one day a cow got out of the corral and she kept calling to Huldah to head the cow. Belle and her friends were trying to help her get the cow back, but they were laughing so hard at the comical way she sounded that they weren't much help. She kept calling Edat Cowolder, Ederolder, in an excited voice. She was a jolly person and kind, always had a twinkle in her eyes, although strict in her discipline. She had beautiful flower and vegetable gardens. She'd bathe her children every night. She had cute corner shelves with interesting knickknacks on them. Belle remembers her having 3 big black trays to serve on and a pretty red rocking chair and a blue one. She'd save her pennies and once each year would purchase 1 new piece of furniture for her home. One of her daughters, Mary Eliza, had a lover's quarrel with her sweetheart, H.C. Bowman, and in anger and haste married a traveling salesman, a dark handsome young fellow she had known only a few weeks, Albert Rain. He was very cruel to her, and when she was expecting her second child she came home to her mother. But she and the child died in giving birth to it. So Grandma raised Mary Eliza's little girl, Effie, from the time she was 3 years old. Then when Effie got married and had 3 children, the 3 children came to live with Grandma and she raised them also, Mary, Percy, and Earl Matson. She was a beautiful knitter and did much knitting. Her 85th birthday was very special. The women of the Presbyterian Church gave her a party and presented her with a huge birthday cake with 85 candles on it. Many Many friends called on her that day. She wore a black dress with a white collar and she blew out the candles. Grandpa Oldham, John, sang in the choir. He was a rock mason, helped to build the Manti Temple, and the old social hall in Mount Pleasant, later known as the North Ward Scout Hall. He worked as a clerk in Gadby store in Salt Lake City, also in ZCMI. After his death, May 4, 1881, Grandma raised fruit from a good orchard they had by the old mill dam, and she also had her land and cows that helped her financially. Her older children were very good to help her by sending her money and foodstuffs. Grandma raised 4 fine boys and 3 good girls to manhood and womanhood. 5 children died in infancy. She died in Mount Pleasant, Sanpete County, Utah, December 8, 1915.